Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gents, this is Prehistory, a Traveler's Guide. I am your host, Greg Norman, and with me tonight are co-hosts Sam Eiler and Scott Mars. Chris won't be here with us tonight, but for all the troubles of getting this set up, we have ourselves a rather interesting guest we have on tonight, Mr. Joe Devito, the author of the illustrated graphic novel sequel prequel to King Kong 1933, Kong, King of Skull Island. All right. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Greetings, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Yep, the topic for tonight is all things Kong, the eighth wonder of the world. All right. For our my first question here is, this is one that Sam had came up with. When did your love of King Kong and dinosaurs begin, Joe?
Oh, my goodness. I would imagine, like all of us, probably about as far back as I can possibly remember. I was born in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan back in 1957. And Hell's Kitchen is, if you ever seen the West Side Story, that's exactly where it is.
Yeah.
It's on the Midtown West Side of Manhattan. And I remember vividly, in that area at the time, there were all the brownstones on both sides of the street. And we had this little backyard. I remember you'd walk out and there was like a little bit of dirt back there. And there was a tree. And it was my one connection with nature when I was a kid. And the things that I remember most vividly were the dinosaur books that I had as a kid. And anybody from my generation, long before you had DVDs and gaming and all of the stuff that you have now, the state of the art were plastic dinosaur toys. And anybody from my generation will tell you with great fondness getting their first set of the Marx dinosaur set with the cavemen and all of the plastic dinosaurs, and that's where it all began.
I had one when I was a kid.
I'm looking at them right now. I still have the Tyrannosaur, not the one with the high two, but the other one that had that beautiful curve on the body. Even as a kid, I was attracted to the lines of it.
Wasn't there a plesiosaur, a chronosaurus, or kind of a moderately short-necked plesiosaur? Seems like I recall there was.
Yes, there was. There was. I didn't have that one as a kid. I had seen it in later sets. From what I understand, especially from looking through, the Bible for this kind of stuff, prehistoric times, with Mike Fredericks. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that, the magazine.
Written an article.
Yes.
They have several issues that go into all the different variations of that original Marx dinosaur set.
I recently published an article in there, an interview with Max Hoffman.
Oh, so I probably read it. It's great stuff.
Yes.
Which brings to the fact I probably need to get subscribed to Prehistoric Times sooner than later.
But what I love about it, what's so much fun, is that it's all about the cutting-edge dinosaur stuff, which we all know and love and want to find out every new thing. But on top of that, it folds in everything dinosaurs, movies, toys, whatever it might be. So it's the whole 360. If you read that every month or every quarter, it comes out quarterly, but you get a real good feel for everything. And especially there, a lot of the guys are, they cover the whole gamut age-wise. So there's a lot of nostalgia mixed in with all of the new stuff, and it's just an absolute blast. And it's all fan-driven, who they send in their art and all of the rest.
Yep. Okay. All right,
can I ask you something, Greg?
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. You guys will edit this back and forth in the end before it goes live. Does that happen?
Yeah, Scott will do whatever touch-ups are necessary to get it to fit into a video file that I can then post to my YouTube channel after it's all done.
Okay, I probably should have asked you that before we began, so that what I'm saying now is not in the conversation. But my point is, Would you like me to go on longer in the answers so that we don't have any dead time? I mean, there's so many things I could say. Just tell me how long or short you want me to go.
Go
As long as you're willing to, Joe.
You know, there are no time constraints.
So,
Two things I'd like to touch on is the inspiration of King Kong by the actual discovery of Komodo dragons, and also the connection, the alleged connection between King Kong and early Loch Ness Monster sightings, specifically the Spicer sighting.
well, that's interesting. I never heard about Kong being connected with the Loch Ness Monster per se, except for the fact that they're both, well, you know, you take the Loch Ness Monster, you know, Bigfoot, Moko Miembe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. You've all heard about that, you know, the purported dinosaur down in the Congo. You know, they're all part of cryptozoology and have their basis in actual existence. In other words, you know, some people believe they may actually be there. Kong is more of a mythical creature, of course. The connection with Kong and the Komodo dragons has its origin, so far as I understand it, you know, that when Cooper, who, you know, traveled the world, became, I don't know if he was actually visited personally the Isle of Komodo, but he certainly was aware of it, and the idea of them existing was one of the original things that sparked his imagining King Kong. And in fact,
that's what I've heard.
Yeah, that is true, so far as I know. I also remember hearing or reading that there is actually some kind of a wall on that island. Obviously not a wall of the epic proportions, you know, in King Kong, but there is a wall. It may be there or another island that also had a lot to do with forming that initial conception by Cooper of King Kong. And of course, cryptozoology, oh my goodness. Any of you guys have shortwave radio ever been on there years back before all the internet came about?
What's that?
Not really.
Oh, so much fun. There was a show originally started by a guy by the name of Art Bell. You probably all heard about him.
Yeah, Coast to Coast AM.
Coast to Coast, yeah. And you're up in the middle of the night and you're hearing about all the, you know, I remember my first time, my girlfriend at the time called me up. You got to turn on the radio. You know, this guy by the name of Roy Mackal, who's a prominent cryptozoologist, you know, talking about the possibility of finding a dinosaur, you know, in the Congo and Africa and all of the different expeditions that they went on and all of the rest. Just a lot of fun getting into the cryptozoological stuff. I don't like all the creepy stuff. I just love the science-based stuff.
That's what I do. I have been actively looking for the Lake Champlain monster for the last quarter of a century.
So what are your thoughts on that? I want to hear about what you found. I'm curious.
Well, I found nothing yet. I saw something that I believe that is probably one of these animals. Back in 1994, that's the only thing that's happened to me personally, but I've talked to a bunch of people that claim they've seen it. And, done a lot of
well, they have some tremendous photographs of the Lake Champlain monster.
Yes.
What do you think of those?
Well, there are 2 or 3 really good ones that I think are probably out there. And what people seem to be describing is something along the lines of a long-necked plesiosaur, whether it is or it's a case of convergent evolution, or people are seeing natural phenomena that resembles a plesiosaur. I don't know yet. So
well, of course, you know, the problem there is the convergent evolution is always a wonderful, what should we say? Convergent evolution can produce some marvelous animals. You know, that one of the great comparisons, of course, being dolphins and ichthyosaurs. You know, one being a mammal, one being a reptile, but they basically evolved the same body plan to solve the same function in nature, for those who don't know what convergent evolution is. But I have a feeling our audience, everybody knows what it is. That being the case, though, you know, obviously anything like a plesiosaur, it's got to breathe air. Somebody would have seen it.
Well,
So
there's even a possible answer around that. There are turtles, aquatic turtles that live in Australia that have turned a sac inside of their butt into basically a fish gill and are breathing underwater.
now there's an interesting concept I didn't think of.
Yeah. So if plesiosaurs had the ability to do that, they could stay underwater.
Scott, you faded out completely.
I'm having audio problems.
I could hear you now. By the way, am I talking too loudly? Because I'm kind of leaning over and my mic is not far. I'm coming in all right?
I can hear you perfectly.
You're coming in excellent, Joe. No problems on my end or Sam's end.
Boy, we're just getting started, and I'm already sorry. We're a whole week late on this. I'm enjoying the hell out of this already. This would have been the best thing I could have done last week if I was able to talk.
The alleged connection between King Kong and the Loch Ness Monster is that one of the earliest sightings of the Loch Ness Monster in July 1933, this couple from London, the Spicers, claimed to have seen a long-necked, large-bodied animal crossing the road in front of their car along the side of Loch Ness and going into the water. And during the interview process of Mr. Spicer, he said that it reminded him of the Diplodocus in King Kong, which they had seen at the movie theaters. And a lot of people have taken that and twisted it around to say that what Mr. Spicer thought he saw was influenced by the Diplodocus sequence in King Kong.
Interesting. Most people don't realize that in the original movie, at least, Kong didn't fight a snake. It was some type of an elasmosaur, what would you want to call it, offshoot, because you could see those little flippers on there.
Yep.
Are we still together? I heard a beep.
Yeah,
Did somebody pop
we're here.
out?
That was Dr. Holtz messaging me.
Oh, okay.
But anyhow, the creature that Kong fought in the original 33 film was indeed a plesiosaur, and indeed in one of the unmade Kong films, The Legend of King Kong, he also fought a plesiosaur.
And of course, my whole story is not based in the original 33 movie. It's based in the original story, which was actually novelized and published before the movie in 32, in November of 32, and serialized in magazine form before that. And there are differences between the two, but the general story line and characters are substantially similar.
Why did you put in mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs, but not plesiosaurs in your novel?
Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that what's a euphemistic way of putting it? As somebody who, because I'm writing and I'm creating the artwork and working on the business end and a whole bunch of stuff with the help of others. But I'd give anything to have 8 arms. There were only so many hours in the day that I was able to work to get things done. It was such a time-consuming endeavor, because I began as early as, I believe my initial conceptions were all the way back in 1992. And then I had contacted the Coopers, I believe in 93, when I had enough to nail down my relationship with them. And my first essentially fleshed out version of what I wanted to do was copyrighted in 97. So one version of it, based in that 97 version, that grew out of that, was published in 04. And then with that, I worked with Brad Strickland, mostly on the writing end of that, while I was doing all of the art. And then now I'm collaborating with Brad on another huge novel in 2, or in many ways 3 parts, that we're going to start launching probably in February.
The errors of Edgar Rice Burroughs are notorious for being quickly to work with. Were Cooper's errors like that, or were they easy to work with?
The sweetest people on earth. as nice as could possibly be. You know, and I had gone through a couple of phases because in the beginning I did not work directly with the Coopers. I was working with their lawyer. One of the nicest, kindest guys, most helpful people I've ever met when trying to work in the business. A guy by the name of Charles Fitzsimons. And I didn't even find out. He was such a humble guy, even though he had done an enormous amount of stuff in his life. He was one of the producers on the 60s Batman show. He had a very heavy Irish brogue even in the 1990s. He goes all the way back to his first movie appearance was in a very small film by the name, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek, called The Quiet Man. Any of you guys ever see that movie?
I think I have, but it sounds familiar.
An all-time classic, and it's not a small movie. It's one of the all-time classics with John Wayne, John Ford, and a lot of my original story, in some ways, not that I echoed The Quiet Man, but there were just, by pure coincidence, a couple of similarities in the sense that the main theme of The Quiet Man is John Wayne, who's an American, and it goes back to discover his roots in Ireland because he wants to get away from what happened to him in America. And I don't want to give away anything if you haven't seen it. But the movie, when he gets to Ireland, he falls in love with a girl, Maureen O'Hara. You all know who Maureen O'Hara is, right?
Yeah, she was from the original Miracle on 34th Street, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. And she was she had her debut, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the all-time classic films, The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Charles Lawton. Yep. She plays Esmeralda.
And who was the big guy that played her brother?
If you didn't just ask me that, I wouldn't have. He was in Gunga Din. Victor McLaughlin. Victor McLaughlin, who was unbelievably good in The Quiet Man. And Barry Fitzgerald, and it just is an unbelievable movie. And the whole movie is a slow build-up to the penultimate fight between John Wayne and Victor McLaughlin in the movie. And the humor in it is just unreal. And to bring the story full circle, it turned out that Charles Fitzsimons, the person who I worked extensively with in the beginning of getting my King Kong property together and getting my rights in relationship with the Coopers together, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, I believe, in Hollywood at the time. It turns out he not only was in The Quiet Man, but he's Maureen. I didn't find out until the end he was Maureen O'Hara's brother. Wow. And he was the guy who scoped out all of the great sets. That movie has such beautiful, where the locations were, where they filmed in Ireland, were just exquisite. And Charles Fitzsimons was at the heart of all of that. And you'd never know it. The most humble guy on earth. And when he passed away right before my book actually got signed, that's when I began meeting the Coopers, Dick and Terry, and working with them personally. We've been very, very close ever since. And, of course, now we're inseparable with our properties and things.
These are Cooper's children or grandchildren?
Children. There is children. Richard Cooper, who, like his dad, had a lifelong love of flying. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. I think he flew over 250 missions. His daughter Terry is, I believe, a heart surgeon, very accomplished and as down to earth as you could possibly imagine. The nicest people you'd ever want to know. I think Marion C. Cooper passed away. I'm going on memory, but I believe in 1973.
Cooper was involved in a lot of Western movies, too. I'm trying to remember which ones.
You faded out completely. I heard that Cooper was involved in a lot of Western movies, and that is absolutely true, and a lot of everything. I don't know if there's ever been anybody like him before or since. If you ever saw Indiana Jones, that is Cooper. And that's only part of Cooper. I mean, he's...
Cooper have a close relationship with Willis O'Brien?
Yeah, Cooper was, instrumental in Willis O'Brien doing the great work that he did. And again, this is me talking in relation to my understanding of things. But, you all know that Willis O'Brien did that phenomenal movie, Creation, where Willis O'Brien essentially created stop-motion animation as we know it.
A lot of that was brought into King Kong, into the movie version.
That's correct. A lot of that stuff, and it was when Cooper saw that movie that he realized that they did not want to use a guy in an ape suit fighting a monitor lizard or something, that stop motion animation was the way to go. And what Cooper brought to the table was, before I keep going there, Greg, there's Greg, he's back. I thought you just dropped off.
I'm here.
Yeah, what Cooper brought to the table was he was a dynamo when it came to business and promotion and all of that. And he provided the vehicle through which O'Brien could perfect his art and completely shine. I always called, through O'Brien, I always called King Kong the most famous Irishman that ever lived, because, O'Brien put so much of himself into it, but he also had a lot of Cooper's personality as well.
Was a boxer, and he brought some of that into King Kong's performance.
Yes, he did. Along with professional wrestling and everything else. It was just, but we have to try to put ourselves in a position where 99% of the people had never seen anything like what stop motion animation could do. And going from being introduced to something totally new and seeing something that not only was new, but something that they could never even have imagined, was just the shock value of it must have been off the charts. And in our generation, there's two basic landmarks that people use. One is 2001, the Stanley Kubrick movie from, I believe, 1969, the special effects in that movie, on how there was a quantum leap forward. And of course, the other huge one in the 70s was Star Wars, the original Star Wars.
Yeah.
But and then of course there's Jurassic Park. When I remember I was well into working on Kong when that came out, thinking, oh man, that's what I wanted to be able to do, in this movie. And I'm looking at this stuff on the screen, but all of that.
Another landmark special effects movie was the 7-Foot Sinbad.
Oh, without a doubt. But they had, that's one next to King Kong. That's my favorite movie of all time in terms of the stop motion movies. The big jump there was that they did it all in color and all of the rest, but stop motion animation had been established at that time.
Yeah, the oldest thing I've seen is The Ghost of Slumber Mountain.
Yeah, that was one of O'Brien's very first movies. Now, you're talking about the one that they did in the 50s or O'Brien's original?
No, I'm talking the one from 1916, I think it is.
Oh, yeah, in 60, yeah, where the tongue is always jumping all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one.
That brings me to another one of my questions that I would like to ask, if that's all right.
Of course.
What other dinosaur-related movies other than King Kong are you a fan of?
Well, that's, there's so many of them. King Kong, just to step back for a minute, I was about 3 or 4 when I first saw it. And as I mentioned, I had my plastic dinosaurs when I was a kid, and I would look at all of the dinosaur books. And from what my mother told me, I began drawing, recognizably and constantly when I was around 3 and a half, something like that. I say this because I would copy all of the pictures from the dinosaur books and all of the rest constantly. But when I saw King Kong, that was the first time these things jumped out of my imagination and I was actually looking at them, and they were real to me. I mean, as real could possibly be. Now, keep in mind, this is all augmented. When I mentioned I was in New York City, in Manhattan, where I was born. I would go to the Museum of Natural History, and I've said this in other interviews and both in print and live. going in there, seeing the bones of the dinosaurs. You can imagine being an impressionable kid. You're, 4 or 5 years old the first time I went, or actually 3 or 4, but, I can't remember. They took me there all the time because they knew I just absolutely loved it. But being little like that and looking up at the huge bones of, the Brontosaurus, and of course, now I know all the modern stuff. You got and I'm getting to your question, Sam. this is coming
all right,
to it, but it's
time.
all part of it. But the idea, we all know how anatomy has changed on dinosaurs, and our understanding has changed, that they're basically more horizontal and how they walked, and they're no longer tail draggers, and all of the rest. You guys all know that. That said, all right, the stuff you grow up with as a kid, it's next to impossible to ever replace the love and the nostalgia involved in that. And I still miss walking into the Museum of Natural History and that upright Tyrannosaur. Imagine being a little kid and walking in and looking up at this thing looming over you like that. The type of wonder that would instill. Now, if you've never been to the Museum of Natural History, I'm sure you're all familiar with the classic upright tail-dragging stance of the Tyrannosaur.
Oh, yes.
Well, in the museum, right to the left of that, was the full-size original skull. The one on that dinosaur mount was a casting. The actual skull was in a big glass case right next to it. And when you talk about loving dinosaurs, to look at something like that, these teeth that are, 8 inches long, and if you look at a whole tooth not in the skull, you're talking about over a foot. Just absolutely awe-inspiring. And so when you talk about dinosaurs, Sam, I saw King Kong, and for the first time, these dinosaurs became alive. And you would think that seeing it in a movie theater would be the most, I would say, for lack of a better term, evocative way to see it. The thing that would, blow your mind the most. And I'm sure that it probably would be. I did not actually see King Kong in the movies until, sometime in 2005 in a movie theater, something like that. When I first saw it, it was on a little 13-inch or 19-inch black and white TV, with the classic, quite literally, hanger for the antenna, in order to get the reception and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm saying is, looking at this black and white film on this little thing with it's got the lighting of King Kong, based in that Gustave Doré. All know who Gustave Doré is?
Oh, yes.
All right. That was purposefully a very influential part of how they wanted to portray the dreamlike atmosphere of King Kong, with that lighting, with things caught in the light, everything else in shadow and all of that kind of thing. And when you're looking at that on a black and white TV screen, it literally was like looking at a dream and not knowing what was going to come. I'm the fifth of 6 kids. I had 4 other brothers and 1 sister. So we had 5 boys and 1 girl. And you can imagine the girl got spoiled rotten in the old school Italian family and 4 lunatic brothers, And my older brother, also an artist, painter, and sculptor like myself, who has, I think, the best name for an artist I've ever heard, Vito Devito. He was the one that first sat me down to watch King Kong. And I didn't know what it was. And you see that fight with Kong and the Tyrannosaur. I mean, how do you put words on that, on how that affects a little impressionable kid? And again, keeping in mind, all right, there's no DVDs back then. There's no CGI. There's no video games. There's only what you could see in the movies, only if you go to the movies, and plastic dinosaurs. And you have to wait and wait and wait for that sucker to be on TV again before you could see it, so that you can't, nothing is as powerful as what you really want but can't have whenever you want it. That's where the beauty of it comes in. Now we could stick a DVD in, you could still frame it, you can go frame to frame. I mean, it's all wonderful from a technical point of view, but from the point of view of something that forms your imagination and inspires awe and dreaming and projecting onto it. There's nothing like getting a glimpse of something and then just grasping for that until you could see it again. And those thoughts that come into your mind, filling in the blanks of what did I see? You know, what happened in that scene? You're trying to soak it in, but it is bending your mind into a pretzel while you're doing it because you just can't believe what you're seeing. That was the effect that it had on me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was, you know, so getting back to your question, Sam, if you thought I wasn't, what dinosaur movies after King Kong did I like? All right, so keep in mind I'm a little kid. I've seen it. All right, and not to go off on a tangent again, but it's all part of the answer. You know, I'm a little kid. My mother's trying not to let me get scared to death watching these movies because I'm still trying to open my brother's Famous Monsters of Filmland magazines.
No, by the way,
you guys remember those?
Oh yeah.
I know of them, but I've never read an issue.
Oh my goodness, there. You know, that's where you got all the B classic. Movie stuff in there, and all the monsters from the 50s and obviously all of them, period. The long short of it is that little by little I began to see these movies, one at a time, mainly when my brothers would, my brother Vito in particular, would sit me down and say, Joe, come on in, there's another one of these things on. Now granted, they were always in black and white when I saw them. We didn't have a color TV. So right along with that are, needless to say, Sam, there's King Kong, the other movie that scared the living hell out of me when I was a kid, but I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, was The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I had more nightmares about that Cyclops coming after me, and yet every night I'd want to go back to sleep and dream about the same damn thing again. And I would go to sleep just concentrating on thinking that, hoping I could have another dream like that because it was so exciting. And the same thing would happen with King Kong. Of course, the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the giant behemoth, which I loved, the son of Kong. But what were you saying, Scott or Sam?
Sorry, I just wanted to. I wanted to add something there.
Yeah.
You say that the King Kong used to scare you as a little kid?
When I was a little kid, I have a vivid memory of everybody being, we were in, have you ever been in a New York brownstone?
No, I don't believe I have. What I wanted to add there is that actually reminds me of something that back when I was a kid, back when I was a kid, I would actually very often watch King Kong on VHS with my dad because my dad is kind of the one who got me hooked on those movies.
He's a good dad.
And whenever it would show a close-up of Kong's face, you know how it would sometimes do that, get a real close-up of Kong's face?
Oh, yeah.
I swear to God, I would hide behind the coffee table because that actually scared the hell out of me as a kid.
I hear you.
Out of the TV and grab me or something.
I hear you. It was that visceral and that real. And how about you guys? Do you guys feel, as real as the effects are these days, to me, even now, I think those old stop motion movies, in many ways, were more real because they were more dreamlike. You knew that they weren't real, and yet because of that, you were able to project onto them, and they became more a part of your imagination than seeing something that is so real looking you don't have to imagine per se.
One that had a big influence on me was Mysterious Island.
Oh, great one.
Yeah, Valley of Gwangi to me still sticks out as one of my all-time favorite Ray Harryhausen dinosaur films to date.
Yeah.
That's an excellent scene in there with the Ceratosaurus fighting the Triceratops.
Oh yeah.
1 million years BC.
I like to think of Ray Harryhausen as kind of the Walt Disney the Walt Disney of monster movies.
Yeah, yeah. That's precisely what he was. You know, what he what he was, I always looked at Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien in a way, the way I look at Mozart and Beethoven. You know, Mozart was, I'm sure you've all heard of Mozart. Probably the most talented all-round musician ever, who wrote in every form possible, masterpieces in every one. But the point being was he wasn't much of a businessman. And he burned out early, died at, I think, 36, because as brilliant as he was at business, or rather at music, he never quite had a handle on how to make it work for him so that he can make a living off of it.
Yeah, I saw that movie with Tom Hulce.
Right, Willis O'Brien was kind of like that in the sense that, he had that original talent, that incredible stuff, but he had so many things, and I know he had a lot of tragic things going on in his life. And I think that he would have made many, many more movies had there been a better business mind behind how to get those movies off the ground. And Harryhausen had that. Like Beethoven was a guy who also was unbelievably talented. But and leaving the deaf part aside, Beethoven was a consummate businessman and was a very wealthy man, in his lifetime and when he died, and knew how to work the art and the market to make it pay off for him.
Ray Harryhausen had Charles Schneer.
That was exactly where I was going. He had
Charles Schneer.
Right. He had those business relationships and knew how to put it together. But again, he was able to build on the shoulders of O'Brien, who came before him, the same way Beethoven built on the shoulders of Mozart. Each of these guys made their contribution to the guy who came after him. And of course, we all know that Harryhausen learned his trade from O'Brien, and then, to say that every special effects guy in Hollywood was influenced by Harryhausen is an understatement. Everybody who came after him.
I mean, name it: Stan Winston, James Cameron, Steven Spielberg. That's just a small list of people. Rick Baker,
George Lucas. I mean, everybody on Earth were all, everybody grew up with Harryhausen.
Harryhausen, Godzilla, King Kong. Those were the big inspirations.
Well, even Godzilla. We all know that Godzilla was actually and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, so let me not put it in a pejorative way. Let's say that it was heavily influenced by the beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Yeah, that's actually not too surprising of a fact, actually.
Yeah, Harryhausen's very first movie was a solo movie, which done on a shoestring, and it's still one of his best. It's great, but that's what brought Godzilla about. Was that?
And speaking of Godzilla, Toho actually, they were big fans of the original 33 film. They had originally wanted to animate their monster with stop motion animation, but it was too expensive for them to do so. That's why they invented the whole pseudonimation process, because it was going to be cheaper.
Even so, the original Godzilla movie, because I remember being out to dinner with Ray Harryhausen and on other occasions, and he was well aware that it was a ripoff of his Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and that being said, I still love that original Godzilla movie. I thought it was a great work of art in its own right. Man in the rubber suit and all. I thought it was beautifully lit, very, very moody and atmospheric. I thought the music was great. And especially when the Japanese original version came out without the Raymond Burr, cuts, that just popping out of nowhere, those close-ups of him talking, But I think it's quite a powerful movie.
Yeah, the original Gojira is a very, very powerful film. It was explicitly an anti-war type of film.
Yeah.
And Godzilla was created as a metaphor for the destruction that was brought forth by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
That's true. That's right.
And also based on a real-life incident involving a ship called the Lucky Dragon number 13, I believe it was.
I remember vaguely hearing that. How does that kick into the original Godzilla story?
It's a real life incident where a ship got caught in the test, it got caught up around a nuclear test site, and the crew members got afflicted with radiation poisoning.
Oh, okay. I
And
didn't know whether they had
that
some
kind of
sea
got
monster.
that they worked that into like the opening of Gojira when the ship's getting attacked by Godzilla.
Mm-hmm. That had that movie had a heavy, heavy influence on me. And again, as a kid, I associate that with the Aurora monster model, monster models of Godzilla and King Kong, the covers of which were painted by Jim Bama, who did all the Doc Savage stuff. And I don't know if you guys know, but I do all the Doc Savage stuff for the past, several years. Over the past 25 years, I painted about 22 of them. So there's synergy through all of that.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to start with one of my questions here. It's about Ray Harryhausen. What was the first Ray Harryhausen movie you seen? How old were you when you saw the said movie? And following up from it, which one had the most impact on your life choosing your path as an artist/writer?
That's the first one, and the one that had the most impact we'd already touched on was far and away The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. That Cyclops and the dragon in there were just beyond the pale, and just a tick behind King Kong as movies that blew my mind as a kid. That being said, in terms of my love of dinosaurs and all of the rest, that was more of a fantasy movie. He's done so many of the great dinosaur movies, and of course the Emir from 20 Million Miles to Earth.
Oh, that's one of my personal favorites.
Oh,
very creative design for the
you
monster.
bet, man. Absolutely fantastic. And when you think that he made every part of that movie, he participated in the writing and did all of the stop motion on his own, all of that stuff. It was the jack of all trades on those movies. It was unreal. And that's what's so wonderful about them, is that those characters, like King Kong and Willis O'Brien, were the product of one man's craft. And their personalities are stamped on those creatures. These days, with all the wizardry is unbelievable, but it's the product of teams of people, and you don't get the same personality per se. Now they're doing, they get the actors with all the lights on them and everything, and they do the acting, and there is a lot in there. Not to denigrate that in any way, shape, or form. It's just that the art involved of a single guy doing stop motion animation is something that I'm just very attached to. So the dinosaurs in the Harryhausen movies, obviously the Rhedosaurus, all of the dinosaurs that he did in 1 million years BC and Valley of the Gwangi. And I've mentioned the Ceratosaurus Triceratops, and that was from 1 million years BC. Right? The Gwangi film had him fighting a Styracosaurus, if I remember, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, all of them. I mean, and then did you guys ever see the rotoscope things that they had where you hold this thing up to your head and it's got the slides so that you see the picture in 3D, where Harryhausen did all of those scenes with the dinosaurs in them? I'm just losing the name of it.
It was the Animal World, I think.
Animal World, that's it, right.
And I had one of those when I was a kid.
Yep. You and me both. It was very cool stuff.
Oh, by the way, Joe, are you aware that at one point Hammer Studios actually planned on doing their own remake of King Kong with Ray Harryhausen to do the stop motion effects?
I had heard of it, yes. Nothing ever came of it, though, right?
No, sadly, this film was never made. Sadly.
Yeah.
Why was Son of Kong such a disappointment?
Well, Son of Kong was rushed out. I believe it came out in 1933, the same year as King Kong. And you all know how time-consuming stop-motion animation is. And I know that Willis O'Brien was unhappy with it. I mean, as a kid, I loved it. It was the only other glimpse of Skull Island I ever got, which is one of the things that, compelled me to want to create Skull Island, in the early 90s was, what happened? Whatever happened to King Kong's body? How did he get on that island? Who built the wall? How did they, all of those questions. Son of Kong was the only glimpse of it we got, but obviously it was played for laughs. And other than the animation and the atmosphere of it, which we all love, there was no real emotional connection between the two movies. It was put out quickly to make money to capitalize on the original King Kong, and has always been regarded by most people as real fans of Kong as a truly enjoyable movie, but it has its shortcomings compared to the original. Can you guys hold 1 second?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm looking for a cough drop. I'm just looking for a cough drop, you guys. Oh, there they are, right next to me. I knew I had them before I started, so my throat doesn't fall out. Just give me 1 second, all right?
All right.
The closest real thing to King Kong that we know about is Gigantopithecus. And to me, if you were going to reimagine King Kong, I think King Kong would work better as a Gigantopithecus.
Scott, I'm losing you, buddy.
He was talking about the closest thing to a real life King Kong being Gigantopithecus, and how Kong species might be possibly descended from this ape species.
In my original History of Skull Island notes, that was the first connection that I made as well, for obvious reasons. Gigantopithecus, I think it's Gigantopithecus black eye is the largest version. There are several different species.
Yes, several. Blackie's the type species and the
Blackie,
largest.
right. And grew to be what, like 9 to 12 or 13 feet high, give or take?
Something like that, and well over 800,000+ pounds.
Right. And that occupied, the Indian continent and all the way down through the Southeast Asia.
Into China, too.
Right. But, from what I understand, from all we really have is the jaw and several teeth. A few jaws and several teeth. And building off of that, they all feel that Gigantopithecus is really more closely related to orangutans than gorillas. And there's something that, so in my first conception, I have Kong as being, descended from or related to, but Gigantopithecus, but it was really based only on the fact that of the size comparison. What I'm coming up, or rather what I have, and what I can't get into here because I don't want to ruin the surprise, is something different in my upcoming book that's going to be called tentatively Skull Island, or Kong of Skull Island, as I've always had that name. But there's more things involved, quite a bit more than Gigantopithecus. That makes for some really cool story stuff, but I hate to drop that but not be able to get into it in detail for the reasons that I mentioned.
Okay, on to a question from group member Jean Francois. His question was, what are your thoughts about the Unmade King Kong versus Frankenstein film?
Well, I got to tell you, this is just my personal stuff. For those, who don't know, and probably everybody who is listening to this or on the site knows, that was a Willis O'Brien idea, that he did a lot of preconception, or rather concept sketches for a King Kong versus Frankenstein movie. I always found it to be it just never made sense to me, to be honest with you. It was more along the lines of the Japanese, the Frankenstein conquered the world or whatever. Where were they going to make something the size of King Kong out of human body parts, if indeed it was going to be a human Frankenstein? Maybe it was something else, but being a dinosaur fan and a monster fan, going all the way back to the very first monster versus monster thing, which I believe was Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. That was the first movie where, two classic characters went at it. Every boy loves that, when you get two monsters going crazy. But that particular one never really made sense to me. What about you guys?
I'm going to have to agree with you. I mean, to me, it just never really made a whole lot of sense either.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I mean, it would be a cool. I think it'd be cool visually, but I don't know how it would have worked.
in,
From what I have read up on the film, though, the Frankenstein monster would have been composed of animal parts.
It would have been composed of animal parts.
Yeah, I've seen the concept arts for the Frankenstein creature. And it
Yeah, I
was
saw
about the
it.
size of Kong.
so what they
Yeah,
did,
it didn't look human at all. It was humanoid, you know, the way a Kong was humanoid or anthropoid, but that would make sense, I guess.
what they
But
did in
what do you
Frankenstein,
think, Scott?
I was going to say what they did in Frankenstein Conquers the World is they had the heart of the original Frankenstein monster become irradiated by the Hiroshima bomb or the Nagasaki bomb. I can't remember which one it is, and it grows into a giant humanoid man from the radiation.
Can you guys hear him? I got the gist of what he said, but on a scale of 1 to 10, he's about a 0.5 on the volume level.
He was referring to the mechanism by which the Toho Frankenstein monster was able to reach its giant size.
Oh, the irradiation from the A-bomb stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, the heart of the original monster being exposed to radiation and thus growing a new monster from it.
Don't you just love all those 50s flicks where the atom bomb is responsible for absolutely everything? You know? I love that.
From dinosaurs, scorpions, giant ants, you name
Yeah.
it.
The giant, did you ever see the giant mantis?
The Deadly
Oh,
Mantis.
yeah.
The deadly mantis. Yeah, love that. I
that
thought that
movie.
was a really cool prop in that movie. It was really, really well done. Although when you think about it, what the hell would a gigantic mantis that big, what would it feed on? Where, I mean, it made no sense at all, but it just was so cool. And my favorite ones that I still love to this day are all the Bird-Eye Gordon movies. The Amazing Colossal Man, and I think one of the best makeup jobs ever. When you talk about stuff that scared me as a kid, The War of the Colossal Beast.
Yeah.
You know,
I love
that thing,
movie.
I don't know what, but there's something about a gigantic humanoid guy like that. I thought that was scary as all hell.
Well, it was half the skull face, too.
My dad and I have a certain fondness for the Incredible Shrinking Man.
Great movie. Fabulous movie.
Okay, here, ready to go on to this follow-up question about this. Outside of Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien from the similar stop-motion monster films, what other ones did you watch while growing up, and what ones were your favorite?
Outside of Harryhausen and O'Brien, which stop-motion movies were my favorite?
Yeah, something like that, like movies like done by Jim Danforth and so forth.
Right. Well, what was the one that Danforth did in the 70s? Dinosaur Planet? Was that it?
When dinosaurs
Planet
ruled
of
the earth.
Dinosaurs.
That was it. That one was fantastic. I was thinking of another one where they're on a spaceship and they land on some planet somewhere, and there's a tyrannosaur that rules everything, and they got to take it on.
Planet of Dinosaurs.
Planet of Dinosaurs. That's it. I like that one a lot. It's just got that weird 70s atmosphere about it. You know, every decade has its own feel for their movies, and I always like that one. And when dinosaurs ruled the earth, I love that. You know,
I gotta say, I thought Victoria Vetri was as sexy as all hell in that movie.
Yeah.
And there's some that say Raquel Welch is even more attractive.
And no argument on either of those counts. I definitely can agree with that. You know, and there was also, I'm trying to think of, there's also that cool King Kong commercial that Danforth did for Volkswagen.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that online.
I saw that too.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And then there was, again, it's more falls into stop motion, not necessarily dinosaurs, but Flash Gordon. They did the one where he did a take on that. It was almost like an X-rated kind of Flash Gordon movie, but they have an emir kind of creature in there, very much based on the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And then there was a movie when I was a kid, and I remember, it's a very low-budget movie in a way, and it's a direct rip-off of the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, but it scared the living hell out of me. It was Jack the Giant Killer. Did you guys ever see that?
I have.
With the cormorant?
Yeah, cormorant.
Yep, and they
And the
they had
sorcerer that
those.
turns into the dragon at the end of the movie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great stuff. And the two-headed cyclops and all. But those floating, things where they use the polarized negative film thing with it scared me like you can't imagine. And talk
Oh,
about the quintessential wizard guy was Torrin Thatcher or Torrin Hatcher. Or was it Thatcher or Hatcher? I forget. The guy who played the magician in the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad.
It was Thatcher.
Sakura, his name
All right.
was.
Nobody was better than him at playing that part.
What about Equinox?
I never saw that whole movie.
Great stop motion stuff in it. I think it's
Yeah, but I saw very little. I just remember that one weird creature grabbing the guy by the shirt collar and smacking him all over the place.
Yeah.
Being fascinated by Greek mythology, I very much love Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans.
Oh, absolutely.
Two very
The
great
bronze
movies.
giant in Jason and the Argonauts. They were saying that Talos,
Yeah.
that one scene. I don't know whether I remember it scared me, man, when Hercules is in there and he steals the brooch.
Yeah.
And the door closes and he gets out and he's looking all around like, who did that? And it must have been the wind, and then you look up.
Down on him.
Yeah, and that creaking head just turns around and looks down at him. Oh my goodness. There's a scene in my first King Kong book where they're in the Museum of Natural History that is directly influenced by that scene. That's where he's having his dream sequence where Kong's skeleton, which is mounted inside the Museum of Natural History, the head turns around and looks down on him. And I got that shot looking up was very much influenced by that. And you know what else we're missing? Two fabulous movies. One, back in the 70s, I believe it was, or it might have been the 80s, is Q, about the flying Quetzalcoatlus that...
Yep. Cue the winged serpent.
Yeah, in the Chrysler building, which was a really great stop motion movie. And then another one that had the stop motion, but also the great use of puppetry, was Dragon Slayer back in the 80s.
Oh.
Love that movie.
Was a phenomenal dragon in that movie, man. That was really, really well done.
Crater Lake
Yes.
Monster?
I saw that, and I'm drawing a blank on it, believe it or not.
The plesiosaur.
Scott
In
talking? I can't hear anything.
For Crater Lake Monster, a meteorite crashes into a lake. It warms up the lake. A prehistoric egg hatches, and out from it comes a killer plesiosaur. Goes on a rampage, killing people. But your typical B movie material, but
Okay.
the special effects for the plesiosaur were well done.
I remember hearing about it. Believe it or not, no, I have not seen that one. I always remember hearing the name Crater Lake Monster, but had not seen it.
Okay, ready to go on to the next question here is, this is about Ray Harryhausen himself. What was it like when you first met Ray Harryhausen in person?
Oh my goodness. That's a day I'll never forget. He was having his book signing. He was having a book signing at the Barnes & Noble bookstore when it was open. I don't know if it still is, on, I think, 57th Street in New York City. And a friend of mine by the name of Arnold Kunert is the guy who initially set up the meeting between Ray and I, because I was trying to, rather I asked Ray to write the introduction to my Kong book. And so in order to do that, I had a whole portfolio of my work, and I went up to meet him, and I had a special meeting with him in the back room before he went out to talk to everybody. They had the whole media was there. It was a gigantic room full of people and everything else. And there was a back and there was a room in the back, and I went in, and he was there with a woman, Rhoda Knight, who is the granddaughter of the great Charles R. Knight. You all know who Charles R. Knight is, right?
Oh, yes.
Definitely.
Okay. So that's when I first met him. And Ray is a tall guy. He's like 6'2" or whatever, and had a very deep voice and very calming, just a very sweet guy. And we were going through all of the pictures and everything, and there's a whole story connected with that I won't get into here. It'll take too long. But it has to do with a statue I had sculpted of the Madonna and Child, and how that, a big monument I was working on at the same time. And that led to the long story being short. That meeting that I had with him went so well that I was asked to go back with him to his hotel after the signing. And we had dinner together that night with Ray, who I sat right next to, and right across from me was, right across from us, at table of four, was Rhoda Knight, and my really good friend Charles Kochman, who was working for DC at the time. He's now at Abrams Books. He's their head guy there for the pop culture department. And we had dinner together for about 2.5 hours and just sat and ate. Ray was like 1 foot away from me, and I'm looking at him, and I'm trying to wrap my brain around the fact that I'm talking to him and we're having dinner together, and it went on for at least 2.5 hours. And we just did nothing but sit and talk all of his movies. And I remember one of the things I remember so well was I told him, the Cyclops from the Seventh Voyage, in particular Mighty Joe Young. In particular, Mighty Joe Young, when I was a kid, scared the living hell out of me. And he said, oh, like that. And I said, yeah, I remember when I was a kid, I got caught alone in the kitchen. Mighty Joe Young was on TV, on that small black and white TV. And that's why I mentioned, had you ever been in a railroad apartment, in a brownstone in New York, which is basically what are called a railroad apartment, because they're, home, because they're like a long railroad car. On one end, on the one side of the building, you have windows. And on the other end, on the other side of the building, you have windows, and everything else in between doesn't have any windows because it's running right through the building. That's what those brownstones are like. So I was at one end of the apartment, one end of our play. It wasn't an apartment. We owned the building. But I was on one end. My whole family was on the other end, and Mighty Joe Young was on. And that scene where Mighty Joe Young is in the open, where you hear the roars. And that's, by the way, one of the great things about King Kong is he didn't have this anemic kind of roar, like they gave him a deep roar, like, how they did that. They played lions and tigers, and then they played it backwards, Really, really deep-chested growls and roars and everything. And Mighty Joe Young comes out, and he's in the open. And the idea of that gigantic gorilla with nothing containing it, nothing between you and it, and he's right there with the lion. Remember the lion in the wagon cage or whatever? And I was telling Ray, I was so scared that I hid under the kitchen table, but I was so mesmerized that I couldn't stop watching it, and I pulled the entire tablecloth down over me and just had my face peeking out of the tablecloth. I had it wrapped around me, covering my whole face except for my eyes, because I couldn't stop watching it. But I was so scared because I was in the room alone, And then I told him the same thing about the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, the Cyclops, how it scared the hell out of me when I was a kid, all of his monsters. And then he corrected me and he says, no, they're not monsters. They're creatures. They're my creatures, He had called them all creatures, not monsters, and did not want them to be scary that way per se. But he got a kick out of the fact, which I'm sure I'm not the first to tell him that.
It's a very, very interesting story there, Joe.
Yeah.
Okay, here. This one's branching off a little bit here. Outside of Kong, are you a fan of the Godzilla series and other sort of Japanese kaiju like Gamera and so forth?
I'm a big fan of the original Godzilla. And needless to say, as a little kid, when King Kong versus Godzilla came out, I was like, bouncing off the walls. But even as a kid, I knew that King Kong versus Godzilla was not the same universe as the original King Kong, for obvious reasons. I love those, I mean, that original Godzilla movie, as I mentioned before, I thought was a really, really powerful flick for a multitude of reasons. And it always left a huge impact on me. And of course, anything involving dinosaurs I liked. Plus, I thought Godzilla was a really cool looking monster, period. as a kid. I wasn't that. Yeah, I was also very much into like Rodan when it first came out because they were treated very seriously. Even Mothra, you know, and of course Ghidra, when Ghidra the three-headed monster. I'm talking about the original one. You know, when they got off into too many, you know, when Godzilla turned into a real kids monster per se, it really didn't do much for me. You know, I was into serious stuff and the dinosaurs and that kind of thing. I was never a big Gamera fan or Anguirus or whatever. Although the second Godzilla movie after the original was Godzilla versus Varan the fire monster, or the what was it renamed?
It was Godzilla Raids Again was the official
Godzilla
title.
Raids Again, right? That was pretty cool because it wasn't played for laughs, but as cool as Godzilla was, the other monster, although it was photographed well and I love the atmosphere of it and everything, you know, the guy on all fours crawling around, just, you know, even as a kid, I could see it just didn't have it.
Yeah, for me personally, I'm more of a stickler for the Heisei era of the Godzilla films, from the 80s to the 1990s, for their overall more serious tone to them.
Same here.
Yep. There was that one. Which was the one where Godzilla is just as nasty can be, and his atomic ray gun, you know, he just uses it to devastating effect. Is it the Destroyer, Godzilla the Destroyer?
Godzilla the Destroyer.
Was that it or no?
It could have been any number of films. It's got to be more specific there. What decade was this set in? But that sounds more like something from the 80s or 90s, because in the late 60s, 70s, he was a superhero, more or less.
Did you like the 1975 Land That Time Forgot?
That I remember very well. And by the way, the Godzilla, it was Godzilla, Mothra, and no, it's Giant Monsters All Out Attack. I think
that's
GMK.
Was it. Yeah, that's GMK 2001.
Yeah, he was that's I think Godzilla at his baddest. Am I correct?
Pretty much. He's pure evil in that movie.
Yeah.
Pure evil and possessed by the souls of the World War II Pacific dead.
Yeah, I forgot that part. All as I remembered was that, you know, he wasn't played for laughs and he killed everything in sight.
Yeah, he was evil.
Oh.
Pure and simple.
Yep.
My next question is, aside from the original film, was there anything else that inspired you to write your story?
Yeah, a lot of things. My story had its origins in a love of dinosaurs, a love of King Kong, combined with a lifelong interest in about 10 other different things. Archaeology, architecture, botany, biology, cryptozoology, you know, all of those things. When I first created that property, the reason I did it was to create my own vehicle that I could pursue all of the things that I love to do all at the same time, to write, to paint, to sculpt, all of the different sciences that I'm into, and blend all of those things into one property. That's basically, you know, what was the impetus of it. And then, of course, to have my own property that I would own, because, you know, as an illustrator, when you're coming up, you're always working for other people and you get jobs based on what commissions you get. And that's all well and fine. And I always love that stuff. But the fact is, I wanted to own my own. And I wanted to do exactly what I wanted to do in terms of the kinds of things I wanted to paint and sculpt and how I wanted to pursue it. And, of course, do it from a 360-degree gamut. So, you know, with, you know, that property, it was great. I got into working with guys who did stop-motion, you know, armatures, and then sculpting and building my own stop-motion creatures for Kong, working on sculptures of it all, doing all of the drawings and the paintings and everything. It was basically something that I could dwell in and indulge myself creatively in every possible way.
very interesting.
Plus answer all of those questions nobody had ever answered before. You know, like they say, if they built that wall to keep King Kong out, how come they put doors in it big enough to let him in? You know,
Because it was built to keep something else out.
Well, that could be. You know, the thing, how did they get that wall built to begin with? If, you know, there's monsters all over that island. How did King Kong get there? You know, and again, an inconsistency in Son of Kong that you don't see in King Kong is that in King Kong, he's the only giant mammal on that island. Everything else is all saurian, which makes you wonder, you know, you guys all know evolution and the process of it and the order of it. You know, most people know, at least I would think, that mammals and dinosaurs essentially evolved at the same time. You know, coming out of the archosaurs, and they basically competed with each other early on, and the dinosaurs mopped the floor with the mammals and took over virtually every evolutionary niche that there was from the size of a chicken on up. The mammals hung on, but they didn't really have a chance against the dinosaurs until they got wiped out. Well, that being what it is, you know, how do you get forget about the fact that he's 18 feet on the island and 25 feet in New York. Let's just say Kong is a 20, 30-foot, anthropoid. How do you get a giant mammal like that on an island populated by dinosaurs? How could it possibly happen? Also, you know, whatever happened to his body? When I was a little kid, you know, being in New York, every time I'd go to the Museum of Natural History, that's where he should be, right? Where else would he be? And how come nobody ever saw it again? Because he was so real to me. So all of those things fed into, okay, this is what I'm going to do a story about.
That brings me to another question that I've actually been really anxious to ask you. What was the inspiration for Gaw and the Death Runners?
Well, one of the things, again, in keeping with the answer that I just gave, one of the logical things is that island is still here. Well, what happened to the dinosaurs on that island over the 65 million years between when all the other dinosaurs died out and now? I mean, did they just stagnate? Or, logically, did they continue to evolve? And that's the whole point of My Skull Island, is that the dinosaurs continue to evolve. The island itself is a character. And in the upcoming book, there's things you're going to find out about the island and what makes it what it is that explains quite a bit of that, so far as I know, nobody's ever delved into before. And the Death Runners and Gaw are basically the logical conclusion to an evolutionary track. When you are looking at something like in my original storylines, what I'm talking about, when you start with something 65 million years ago, as wondrous as a Troodon, right, that had opposable thumbs and fingers, the largest brain to body ratio of any dinosaurs, binocular vision, you come up with, and when you're given it an additional 65 million years of evolution, you know, if you're not arriving at pure, you know, complete sentience, you're real close to it. You know, I mean, when you think about the human race, as I understand it, and again, all of this stuff is fluid because, you know, I'm very much into science, but I take it all with a grain of salt in the sense that science is not a period in my mind. It's a question mark. All right. It is what it is until we find out something new that changes everything. You know, you look at Newton and Einstein as perfect examples of that, on how you can accept a certain reality until you find out that's not what you really thought it was all along, right? Science is a big, giant question mark. And as it stands right now in terms of human evolution from what we know, and again, that could change any time, humans evolved over a period of, and I'm going back, I should have recounted, but I'm fairly certain we're talking about 250,000 years ago up until about 50,000 years ago when the first modern humans are in that area. Am I correct? Generally
that sounds
speaking?
about right.
All right, generally speaking. That is a tick of the clock when you're talking about 65 million years. And that's for humans to come about from primitive ancestors. So what would happen to dinosaurs, starting with something that we know, which would be a Troodon, which is the only thing, which is what we know of at this point, all the dromaeosaurs and all of the rest. You know, to me, the Death Runners are a natural conclusion at the least. And then the whole mythology I built up about, now again, it has to do with the size of the island and the limits of the environment that they're in, and what led from a pseudo-sentient saurian like the Death Runners, which are not velociraptors. They're way beyond velociraptors. It would be the equivalent of, us and chimps, with a velociraptor being a chimp and a Death Runner being us. So there's no contest between the two of them. But I was also influenced from my take, anyway, that I thought would be a fun mental exercise. You know, you guys are all familiar with the Dino Man, like what happened if dinosaurs didn't die out. You know,
the Dinosauroid it's called.
Right. But what do they do?
Russell.
It's the idea of, they took a dinosaur, something, let's say you take a coelosaur, right, or a Troodon, something like that, which has that long neck, right? I was always curious why something that would have a long neck like that, yeah, the head would get bigger, the brain would get bigger, you'd want to pull the head back towards the center of gravity, shorten the neck a little bit, but would it necessarily get the same basic proportions as a human being in terms of the size of the head and the neck? I don't think so. You know, why would you give up something that offered you all of those advantages of being able to turn your head around and reach for things and everything? So my feeling is a sentient dinosaur would not end up looking like that, thing that they came up with to try to make it look like a human being. What I thought they would come up with, what would happen, at least in my zeitgeist, my universe, would be the Death Runners and the culture that is built up around them. Now, again, I got into it very preliminarily in that my first Kong book and in the original Skull Island, but this second one gets into them in great, great detail in terms of their relationships, what they are like culturally, and how they relate to Gaw and the influences of them. Did that answer it, Sam?
Yes, that answers it perfectly. Okay. From what I understand from reading your book, it seems that almost all of the creatures, except for Kong himself on the island, fear Gaw and the Death Runners. It sounds as though even the Tyrannosaurs fear her.
That is correct. That is correct. But there also is a balance on there. They fear them in the sense that the same way a tiger would fear a human being. You know, if you got caught one-on-one, I have a feeling we'd be afraid of the tiger, right? But when in terms of where civilization starts encroaching on wild nature, the animals tend to shy away and basically avoid human beings for the obvious, because they end up getting killed. But that does not mean that they are not still dangerous in and of themselves or anything else. Now, it's not as though the Death Runners, and I'll get into certain details here, it's not as though they have the kind of civilization on Skull Island the way we have here, with cities and towns and that kind of thing. So that's a separate thing, but it's the idea that there is a natural aversion to a natural aversion of the lesser evolved dinosaurs towards the higher evolved ones because they lose. So even a tyrannosaur, which is something that is basically a force of nature, would not be afraid of anything per se, because its nature really does not allow it to be. It is what it is. I don't think that something like a tyrannosaur looked at anything in terms of fear, except maybe another tyrannosaur. It just looked at, there's something, I'm going to kill it and I'm going to eat it. And it's just a matter of how. But on the other hand, something a tyrannosaur is not something that an individual Death Runner would want to take on. A pack of them? Quite possibly. An interesting analogy there would be a pack of wolves against a grizzly bear. A pack of killer whales against a bull sperm whale. That kind of thing. It's not something they would want to do out of hand. Maybe at the in extreme circumstances. But that being said, it would be an interesting fight between a full-grown bull T-Rex and Gaw. But the Gaws are not always there. There's a reason for them, why they come about, and the things that produce them.
Well, if they did fight each other, though, I would say it's a pretty safe bet that Gaw would probably win, because Gaw appears to be bigger and more intelligent.
That is a correct assumption.
And the other X factor, Gaw has fully functioning, usable arms, which Rex does not have.
And also, it's pseudo-sentient. It also would have the use of weapons of a certain kind. There's the possibility of that.
And plus having full command of the Death Runners to come to her aid when need be.
That also is correct. She is one nasty human, one nasty saurian.
Wouldn't want to get on her bad side. Okay, here. All right, this is one thing. This is about your just gone. If you're willing to answer this, how many different species of dinosaur live on your version of Skull Island?
That's a great question, and quite frankly, I haven't cataloged all of the species of dinosaur on Skull Island. What I do is I introduce more and more and more of what is there, but by no means is there any kind of comprehensive list per se. That being said, there are things that are introduced into the geology and biology of that island that affect everything on it in very, very unexpected ways. And that's as far as I could go without giving away fun stuff.
Well, we all know that there are dinosaurs living on Skull Island, but I think one of the big questions that have been on a lot of people's minds is, how did the dinosaurs get there in the first place? I mean, how did they manage to survive?
Well, that's, again, part of that I want to answer. I can answer now, but other things I don't want to give away. But let's suffice it to say that they've always been there. That Skull Island was something connected to other things at one time and became isolated. As an example, in modern time. By the way, not to digress, but is Scott still with us?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I hadn't seen any. Hadn't heard. A perfect modern example is the Galapagos Islands, right? What happens when, and Madagascar is another example, is what happens when land masses are isolated from everything else. You have individual, I would not necessarily call it evolution on the modern day equivalents of Madagascar and the Galapagos, although I'm sure evolution has taken place there, but it would more accurately be described as adaptation, right? When you're looking at different tortoises on different islands adapting because of lack of predators, certain, geological things, plants that they feed on, all of that, they take on certain forms and looks for that reason. So in terms of Skull Island, it's not how did the dinosaurs get there. It's more of how did they manage to keep surviving there when everything else died everywhere else, because they've always been there.
And I have a question about the dinosaur species itself. Is there going to be an explanation for how dinosaurs from different time periods ended up being on this island when they normally would have never got into contact with one another on the mainland, for example?
Yeah, there's, like, for instance, on... it's an interesting dichotomy in the original King Kong movie as opposed to the novel, which does not get into, except when I rewrote it with Brad Strickland, the original, we got much more into the science of it and much more accurate paleontologically in terms of describing them. But getting into, when you go back to the original movie, what's interesting there is that Cooper has alluded to the T-Rex that fights Kong as being an allosaur. And I know that, if you look in the movie, you see the 3 fingers on there, as opposed to the T-Rex, which has 2, and the allosaurs have 3. But it was quite obviously in the movie meant to be a T-Rex. They actually had 3-fingered hands on the T-Rex early on when it was first discovered. The Hell Creek, the original skeletons. If you look at the original mountings or when they were working on mounting it and designing it, they actually had 3 fingers on the hands of the T-Rex. And you know that the arms in relationship to the body of an allosaur are much bigger than the arms of a T-Rex in relationship to the body. And the head shape and everything else and all of the rest of the T-Rex and King Kong was just that, not an allosaur. But that being said, all of the other dinosaurs were all Jurassic era dinosaurs, right? You had the Brontosaurus, and I'm talking in 1930s terms. You had the Stegosaurus. You had the Elasmosaur. That could be either way on there. You had but then if you get the Son of Kong, you got a Styracosaurus, which is the Ceratopsian, which was very much in the Cretaceous era, right?
Yes.
And so it does, I was going to say, in the original King Kong, it was almost uniformly Jurassic era. But when you look at Son of Kong and you look at other things, they mix in the Cretaceous. In my zeitgeist, there is very much a uniformity to what is, it's not a mix of, let's say, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. That being said, they used to think that sauropods were basically gone by the time the Cretaceous came around. We now know that that's not the fact at all. In fact, some of the biggest ones that ever lived were still alive.
Yeah, the southern hemisphere was pretty much ruled by titanosaurine sauropods throughout the Cretaceous period, all the way up to the extinction event.
That's correct. The Patagonias, you've got the Argentinosaurus and all of the rest. So they kept on living down there. So I try to pay attention, and I do pay attention to that linear line of dinosaurs. It's funny, most people, you guys all know this, but, regular, people who are not dinosaur fans, it's interesting when you think about it, that a stegosaur, for the most part, lived as far away from a tyrannosaur in terms of time as a tyrannosaur is from us.
Yeah, I've heard that exact same before, just recently, as a matter of fact.
It's mind-bending when you think about it.
Yeah.
And just as a side note, did you guys ever imagine, that they would actually find soft tissue inside a tyrannosaur bone?
Well, you think that's impressive? They found a preserved dinosaur tail in amber in a Myanmar mine just recently.
That's how I was going there next. Does that blow your mind or what?
The second one is probably the most significant find of the century, for me personally. That and the T-Rex, tissue that Dr. Mary Schweitzer discovered.
And think about that dinosaur tail that they found. Granted, it was of a little dinosaur the size of a sparrow, and it's just a tail. But you got that piece of amber, and somebody had already worked on it. Can you imagine there's a possibility that the whole thing could have been in there? And that would be in other pieces of amber very easily? And they also had that iguanodon, where it was fossilized in rock, but they had the whole dinosaur there, where they did that National Geographic special, where all the organs were there and everything else. You guys have seen that, right?
Yeah, they call them dinosaur mummies, which are dinosaurs that have the flesh fossilized.
Yeah, but this thing had the whole thing there, and it really changed their the way that they looked at how bulky that tail was and how powerful it was and all of the rest. It's just mind-bending stuff. And then you got Horner doing that reverse evolution stuff with chickens.
Yeah.
I sometimes think that, well, this is my opinion, of course, but I sometimes think that Jurassic Park is slowly on its way to becoming a reality.
I hope you're right, Sam. I sure would love to be around to see it.
Same here.
There's talk about cloning the woolly mammoth here in the news lately.
That's the thing that gives me pause about the Jurassic Park end of it, because you would think that they would have no trouble at all being able to clone a woolly mammoth. But evidently, even that's tough.
And that DNA is tens of thousands of years old.
Yeah, but
One.
you figure, that's not that's a blink of the eye compared to the 65 million years. And plus, they've got perfectly frozen carcasses. It's interesting that they haven't been able to do it yet.
Some people have even talked about cloning Neanderthals, but personally, I'm against that. I mean, I don't have a problem cloning an animal, but a Neanderthal is a human being, and there are definitely ethical concerns that go along with that.
I completely agree with you. I think that ethics and morality have a lot to say in terms of the decisions that we make. And it's one of the problems that I think science can run into is when it runs too far ahead of the ethical and moral dynamic of that is created by whatever the thing is that they're trying to do. I don't believe in science for science sake, that you just do whatever the hell you want because you can. I think that the ethics and the morals do have to be taken into account, especially when it comes into dealing with human beings.
Yeah, because if we did clone a Neanderthal, I mean, how well would it adapt to our modern human times? I mean, I'm sure that it would be quite scared and confused because of how different everything would be. All the lights, all the noise.
Well, here's the thing. I wonder, really, I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was talking about this series on HBO, Westworld. And I had not seen the episode that he was talking of, but Anthony Hopkins plays the main scientist on there. And one guy asked him, and I'm paraphrasing because I didn't see the exact thing, but, the gist of what I'm saying is correct, is what do you think happened to Neanderthals? And Hopkins, in his typical delivery, says, we ate them. That's one way of looking at it, that everything is so vicious out there, and evolution takes that kind of kill or be killed, the strong survive kind of thing. That's one way. The other thing is that, we all have Neanderthal in us. How did that get there? I know that most people have from, 0.1 to up to 2.5% Neanderthal DNA. So evidently, if that's the case, we had to be able to interbreed. And I wonder how, if we were that far apart as a species. So, did Neanderthals actually become extinct, or did we meld with them? Or did we meld with some of them and ate the rest of them? Or were they able to not, keep up with us in general? That's a very, very interesting question. Some people say that, they didn't have the throat structure to be able to speak the way that we can, and that's part of it. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, the Neanderthals were definitely not as stupid as a lot of people think of them as. I mean, in a lot of old movies and comics, Neanderthals are depicted as dumb and ape-like, but we now have evidence that suggests that they were probably a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
They had bigger brains than humans did, than modern humans do, and they even have signs now of showing some type of, if I'm not mistaken, they discover, they've got grave sites that indicate some type of spiritual nature in terms of burial rites, perhaps not as much and not anywhere near as much as modern humans, but they still were able to form tools and possibly even art of a very primitive kind. There was definitely a difference between the two, but it makes for a very, very interesting dynamic in terms of how that factors in to other things.
Well, what are your views on it, Greg?
On Neanderthals?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they do know that they did interbreed with Homo sapiens, because we have DNA evidence of this. Culturally speaking, they've actually found the evidence of them building, underground tombs and so forth not that long ago. Very intricate, very advanced. tombs. And of course, culturally, they might have had some shortcomings in comparison to Cro-Magnons, but they were not humanity's inferiors, so to speak. It's
Yeah,
a
they
very
were.
complex subject, to say the least.
Yeah, very.
Scott, do you think that there could possibly be some kind of a link between Neanderthals and Sasquatch, possibly?
Well, some people think that,
I have no volume on Scott at all.
The Neanderthals were just a subspecies of Homo sapiens. They were Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, at least as far as I know.
Okay.
You know, their whole structure was based on their environment. They were from, if I'm not mistaken, basically emanating from Northern Europe. And they were, squatter, and all of the rest to retain body heat. They were dealing with the more frigid temperatures. And the modern humans came up from Africa. They met the Neanderthal someplace around Southern Europe. And then the Neanderthal gradually faded away. Whether they basically just became absorbed by humanity or became extinct, I don't know.
I personally feel it was more as a gradual assimilation into the human race genetically across time. There's also evidence that humans interbred with another hominid human species called the Denisovians.
Mm-hmm. And that's only what we know. Then there's a whole hell of a lot that we don't know yet. So it's going to be real interesting.
Okay, I'm ready to move on to one of my other questions here. Were there any paleo artists whose work inspired the way you depict dinosaurs?
Oh my goodness, yeah, goes without saying. Needless to say, the two great ones, well, the three, but I consider the two truly the greatest of them being Knight and Burien. And they're kind of interchangeable in a way. I mean, Burien was just unbelievably prolific. And of course, his depictions of dinosaurs in some ways not as accurate as Knight's, but that not being reflective of his inability to do so. It's the scientist that he's dealing with, the whole era that he was in growing up, being a Czech artist under the communist boots, so to speak. So his access to certain things were very different. Knight had a whole different style, but the two of them, to me, were the giants on which everybody else stands on. The third I was going to say is Zallinger, who I grew up with in the 50s as well. But he had some brilliant technique on the mural, the Yale mural, much more on the study that he did for it, that I saw the original of, which is just absolutely beautifully done. But his anatomy on his dinosaurs, particularly his T-Rex, is just so far out there compared to, let's say Knight, who I think had the most accurate in some ways in terms of really getting what it looked like. The Burien, that famous Burien piece where the T-Rex is going after the Trachodon or the Hadrosaurs, whichever species of it was. It's a bit out of whack in terms of head to body proportion and whatnot. But all three of those guys, those were the three main ones. And then of course you have all the modern guys, that you have now. But those three guys are the ones that I think everybody's based in.
Very, very interesting. And did you consult with any paleontologists when it came to doing your dinosaurs for your Kong series?
Yeah, I did. I think I spoke to, in particularly, rather interestingly, today I posted one of my earliest little studies of an ichthyosaur scene with the toothless ichthyosaurs, the ophthalmolosaurs, however the hell you pronounce.
Ophthalmosaur.
Yes, and I believe the guy's name. I think he was an Australian paleontologist. I just forgot his name. I don't know if Norman was the last name. This is going back a few years. But at that point, so many dinosaur books were out. And there are guys I know based out of Philly who I would always consult all the time. But there was so much stuff out in dinosaur books. It's pretty, you know, you can get a pretty good handle on how all of it worked just by reading diligently everything that's out there.
Are you talking about Ben Keir?
Say that again, Scott.
Benjamin Keir?
I can't hear him.
Benjamin Cure, I think, is what he's saying.
No, that wasn't the one.
All right, if we're ready to move on here, this is about James Gurney. Have you heard of James Gurney's Dinotopia book series? And if so, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, Jim's, I know him, we know each other well. I've been to his place, and he was somebody that I talked to often in the very early days of creating my Kong property, and we ran stuff back and forth on several occasions. And he's a brilliant dinosaur painter. Dinotopia is a very different kind of story than the kind that I'm telling. His character setup and the things that drive them and the whole interaction of them is different. But in terms of being a phenomenal dinosaur painter and being a talented painter, period, Gurney's wonderful.
Yeah, same here. All right, next question. Are you a fan of the Jurassic Park series, and did it have any influence on your Kong stories?
I'm a huge fan of the series, but the stories that I have and what I've done were actually already in place before the Jurassic Park movie, the first one, ever came out. The Death Runners and everything else were created before that. So it's just seeing that from a technical point of view. And of course the DNA thing, I didn't have, anything, I don't have any of that in what I do. But in terms of just being mesmerizing from a entertainment point of view, you can't beat them. They're wonderful. The first one in particular is just great.
I kind of would like to ask a little fun question about that. In your opinion, if these two were to fight each other, who do you think would win? Gaw versus the Indominus Rex, that hybrid dinosaur from the most recent Jurassic Park film.
That's interesting. There's some similarities between the two. Gaw being, but in terms of the way that they portrayed that one, and what I created in Gaw some years earlier, I would still have to give it to Gaw for a multitude of reasons. One of them being that the Indominus Rex, or whatever they called it, it was basically a rogue dinosaur who had no social parameters and no ability to orient itself. For instance, I don't know if you guys follow what happened. I'm sure that you do, actually. With all of the elephants being killed in Africa, there are instances now of young male bull elephants growing up without older male elephants to teach them and keep them in line. So they're basically like gigantic bullies. They grow up, they roam the countryside, they kill rhinoceroses, they're finding dead everything. It was a pretty disconcerting to see a rhino carcass with these two gigantic holes in it from the elephants that just gored them to death with their tusks. And when you have something like that, basically what you've got is a malformed adolescent. And the way that they're redirecting those elephants is to put them back in herds with bulls of, who grew up normally, who basically just beat the blank out of them until they get in line, and they learn the meaning of fear. So my point is, when you're looking at Gaw versus an Indominus Rex is more like these rogue juvenile elephants that have no social parameters. And so they basically are free to do whatever they want until, of course, they run into something that is bigger, stronger, that has more of a well-balanced psychology, if you want to put it in those terms. And that would win out every time because it's an adult versus a juvenile, something with experience based in reality, and knowing how to deal with all of the vicissitudes of life, as opposed to something that's never been challenged before, which would probably crack under the pressure. Does that make sense to you guys?
Oh, yes, it does indeed.
Well,
And another thing, Indominus Rex has all this different dinosaur DNA in it, so psychologically, it's a wreck. It's got conflicting instincts going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of it is Majungasaurus, which is known to be a cannibal. And that explains why it killed its one sibling it had.
Yeah.
Yep, it's interesting that way.
Well, in the movie, Chris Pratt's character pointed out that a possible reason why the Indominus Rex was so violent was because it was raised in isolation, which made it mentally unstable.
Yeah, that the same thing could be said for these rogue elephants. That literally is. They are unstable. There's no, culture needs rather individuals need culture. One of the things that they mention often about why Homo sapien, why modern humans developed so quickly is when, we were able to start cultivating things, and we no longer had to worry about just survival, but that we had spare time, that we were able to utilize the advantages of, let's say, grandparents and great-grandparents that could be there to raise the children, as opposed to all of the adults being out hunting and having to reinvent the wheel all the time. We were able to create family units that were able to educate young children with what was learned by the older generation, while the mid-generation, strong enough to go out and hunt, would go out and hunt, and therefore we form culture. We're able to advance without having to reinvent the wheel, but build on the ideas that came before. So when you don't have culture, what you've got is basically nothing, I didn't express that right, but you get the gist of what I was trying to say.
I understand.
Exactly.
I hope.
And this is also a problem with some animals in captivity. When they're isolated and they're subjected to abysmal conditions and no stimuli, no contact from other members of their species, if they're social by nature, many of the times they do go mad. They go mad, go psychotic. They do lash out at people. And this has happened with elephants in captivity when they've just had enough of the abuse and they start attacking people because of that.
That's correct. It's not the animal's fault. You ever go to a zoo and see a tiger or a lion pacing back and forth in their cage neurotically like that? Any creature with a higher intelligence would go out of their mind sitting in a cage. Or not, even if you're not sitting in a cage, even if you're out in the open, it's the idea of not having interaction. They say, I've heard it said, that if you were deprived of food and water, you could last a few days. But if a human being is deprived of any hope or sense of companionship, they would die in minutes. The psychological makeup of a creature is far more what's the word I'm looking for?
Fragile.
Fragile, but has a far greater effect on a being than its physical nature. And for a creature that is highly evolved cerebrally and socially, to be utterly deprived of companionship or anything else, that is far greater than any kind of physical pain.
Yeah, for primates, this is especially important.
Yeah.
Being part of a group is very necessary to their well-being.
Any animal that is of a higher nature, I believe that applies to. Elephants, whales, anything like that. Even, dogs and stuff like that. They need that companionship. They're pack animals.
Well, I find myself pacing in my room sometimes when I'm dying of boredom because I'm just so bored and I have nothing else to do and I just want to hang out with somebody and talk with someone.
It's a natural human part of being a human being, Sam.
Yeah, that's why solitary confinement is considered by psychiatrists and so forth
Torture.
as literal torture. Yes,
Yeah, that's right.
one of the worst
All of us
possible
have
means
known
of torture.
any person old enough to be an adult knows that, you know, psychological pain is worse than physical pain.
Physical pain passes, but psychological scars could haunt you for the rest of your lifetime.
That's right. And that's basically it.
And the same would hold true for animals that were subjugated to mistreatment and abuse, be it wild animals or even domesticated animals like dogs and cats.
That is correct. I agree with that. Torture of the worst kind.
And you think, Kong being isolated from others of his kind could have had any influence on his personality by the time that the Denim expedition encountered him?
Well, that's part of my whole first book, my whole first storyline that I could talk about, because I've already got that out there, is the idea of, why did Kong not break through that wall before? Because why did he allow that to go on, the human sacrifice that they did to him and all of the rest, and what did he do with those human sacrifices? And what they find out in my first story, I don't know whether I want to give all this away if people haven't read it yet, but let's just say that other than the humans on that island, there is no other connection that Kong has with anything of his own kind. There may be little, but there's actually a relationship of a kind going on there, and that's the only place that Kong can experience it. They're the only other humanoid anthropoid creatures on that island, and that has an effect on him and what he does with those sacrifices and everything else, which I won't get into more detail on for people that did not read.
Yeah, best to save that for the next book.
Yep.
Okay, this is a question from William Paul Grundler. What is the first creature you remember doing that you really love, and that cemented your desire to do dinosaurs for the rest of your life?
Say that again, Greg?
The question is, what is the first creature you remember doing that you really love, and that cemented your desire to do dinosaurs for the rest of your life?
Oh, that goes without a T-Rex. I have pictures from the time I was already drawing skeletons when I was like 6, 7, that I have pictures of still that are pretty accurate. It's amazing for a little kid that, that T-Rex skeleton based off of, I believe, the end papers of the Zallinger book, The Golden Book of Dinosaurs, one of my all-time favorites with that big brachiosaur. If you go to my Facebook page, Kong Skull Island, I just posted that last week, some of the early dinosaur books, and I'm going to follow that up with other, pictures from them. But yeah, the T-Rex, I mean, there were the things that I drew incessantly as a kid that absolutely mesmerized me were dinosaurs of all kinds, in particular the T-Rex. I don't need to tell you why. Every little kid loves that, Sperm whales and great white sharks and stuff like that. Absolutely love them. Any kind of animal I was mesmerized by. When I was a little kid, it was at a time where in our neighborhood, we still didn't even have a supermarket yet, at least not one that I knew of. Every day, as I mentioned, I was the fifth out of 6 kids. So being in a classic Italian family in New York, everybody, I remember my grandmother, who I never understood. She was the only one of my grandparents I ever met, because my mom was the 10th out of 10 kids, and I was the 5th out of 6. So everybody was dead by the time I was born when it came to grandparents, except for my grandmother. And she only spoke Italian, so I never really understood her. But I do remember that she was the most unbelievable cook on planet Earth, as far as I was concerned. We used to have guests over all the time, and every day or every other day, whenever they wouldn't go to the supermarket, they would take me with them. My mom would take me to the butcher shop, the fish market, the vegetable stand. There was a separate thing, and they'd get their food fresh every day. And I'm saying this because those were some of the formative experiences of my life, because it was there, again, I'm in the middle of Hell's Kitchen in New York City. About the only thing that you see in terms of wildlife is the pigeon, and the odd rat, mouse, and roaches or whatever, wherever you'd see them. That's it, except when I went to the butcher store and the fish market. The fish market in particular, because the butcher store, everything was already gutted. And you'd see pigs and chickens and whatnot. It was all hanging in there in a classic Italian market. You got the sausages and the cheese and this and that. And the aromas of it were just unbelievably good. But the fish market, you would have everything from red snappers, but the whole fish. And they're right there on piles of ice. Mackerel, snappers, octopus, squid, whatever it might be. And I would go in there and I was just mesmerized. I would be fooling around with their jaws. I got yelled at constantly. I'd be rolling their eyeballs around. And I was checking this stuff out. How did these things work? I just had a natural attraction to anatomy and the way that animals worked and moved. And those times, I remember them vividly, and back when I was a kid, now they talk about salmonella and they won't let kids have them, but they had those little green turtles that every kid in New York had. And you had the goldfish and and I remember, other turtles and my grandmother, you guys know what escargot is?
Oh, yeah.
Right? You'd never think that you would eat snails, but anybody who has ever had really good escargot with drenched in butter garlic sauce, it's to die for. It's unbelievable. And they would take us, and my grandmother would get, I had uncles, 2 of them were priests, and we used to have the cardinals and the archbishops, because my grandmother was like a famous cook in the area. They would all come to our house for some of the major holidays. There'd be like 15 of them. And we were like the only Italians, I remember. Everybody else had a very heavy Irish brogue. And there's some hilarious stories I could tell you. But the point is, she would make a feast. And I remember her getting big buckets of snails to make escargot. And I would always steal a few of the snails because, they'd come out of their shell and start crawling around. And then for whatever reason, I was just mesmerized. I remember a couple of times just waiting, and then it'd come out and then I hit it with a hammer. I don't know why. It was just the idea that this thing, you'd wait for it to come out and you'd smash the thing, Typical stupid thing a kid would do. But it was going to those markets that I was introduced to different kinds of animals in reality, literally feeling what scales felt like, and how sharp the teeth were in a red snapper or a bluefish, how gills worked and what eyeballs felt like. And I would make this stuff out of Play-Doh. I used to make sperm whales out of Play-Doh when I was a little kid, 4 years old, and I'd leave the stomachs hollow, and I'd make sharks and squid and shove them down the throat of the whale so that it would be inside the whale. And I would read all of the whaling books, on how they would harpoon whales and they'd peel the blubber off and how it was all done. And I would do that with the Play-Doh. I would hang it up with with sewing thread, and then I'd peel the layers of blubber off until I got to the shark inside of it. It was a whole biological kind of the way that stuff worked. I used to love anatomy and muscles and animals in general, how joints worked. And I was, how did I get off on this? What did you ask me about? You brought back a lot of good memories. What made me start drawing dinosaurs? Was that it?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. Well, that all added into it. That was a very long-winded answer. But even as a little kid, I loved the way animals worked and the way bones and muscles fit together. I was naturally attracted to it.
That's just like how Charles Knight got started, too. Very similar to what you just described.
Yeah.
He even wrote a book about animal anatomy and so forth. And
I've got it.
Do it in your... I haven't read it yet, but I intend on buying it someday.
Yeah.
I've got 2 books on Charles Knight specifically. One written by Don Gluten, the other one by Richard Milner.
Mm-hmm. I believe I have both of them. And did you ever get the book that Abrams Books put out that my friend Charlie Kochman was part of on the creation of the dioramas in the Museum of Natural History?
I don't think I've seen it.
Some of the greatest, when we're talking about animals and anatomy and all that, as a little kid when I would go into the museum, and you would see the bones and you would see partial, they have certain cutaways about how bones are on muscle, muscle is on bones and, insides of things and everything else. Absolutely fascinating. But those dioramas, when you go into the main halls and it's like a church, literally, it's almost like a place of meditation. You go in and they've got these incredibly perfectly put together environments of whatever the animal is. One would be for tigers, another would be for lions and grizzly bears and whatever. One is all African animals, another is all Asian, another is all animals of North America. And the way that they were put together and the background paintings and the artists who did them are, to this day, they just utterly mesmerize me. Some of the most beautiful works of art you've ever seen, especially in their totality, not just the paintings in the background, which are exquisite, but the way that they blend with the plants and the animals and everything else that are there. They're just utterly stunning. All of that goes into me why I drew what I drew, the way I do.
And just this past summer, I got to go to the Field Museum for the first time, and that's where I got to see Charles Knight's art for the first time in person. I was just speechless seeing artwork in person. I only ever saw it in books and on television. I just felt like, for lack of a better word, reverence.
Yes.
For seeing literal history that's been up on those walls since the 1920s or 1930s, like half a century ago.
Well put. And they're beautiful. In the Chicago Museum, that classic scene with how prescient was that? With the T-Rex already walking horizontally a little bit, facing the Triceratops?
Yeah, that's his most iconic piece, and it was sort of ahead of the times. Actually, Hollywood was actually ahead of the times in some of those earlier films.
King Kong was the first film, the Creation did it too, but King Kong to a more famous extent, actually portrayed everything scientifically.
As did the first adaptation of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World.
Yep. Great stuff.
Do we have any other questions to go over? Or we pretty much covered everything by now?
Well, I might want to talk about some of the unmade King Kong films. I mean, what are your thoughts on the Legend of King Kong that Jim Danforth is going to be involved with?
I don't know much about that one. Was that going back? Is that something that's a recent thing, or going back to the 70s or 80s?
This was during the 70s. This was during the production of the 1976 movie. It was part of a massive legal battle between Universal Studios and Paramount Studios at the time over who was going to get their Kong movie off the ground first.
Yeah. Okay. I remember vaguely. Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually supposed to be Universal Studios' first attempt at remaking King Kong. Their second attempt came in 1996, where Peter Jackson was trying to make his version, but again, it got canned, and Universal finally didn't get to make their version of King Kong until 2005 with Peter Jackson.
Yeah, all of that I'll stay away from, because that starts treading into other areas I can't talk about.
All right, I apologize if I brought up something I shouldn't.
That's all right. As long as we could edit it out,
The film in the 70s that Jim Danforth was involved in was set in the 1930s, like the original movie was. And according to Ray Morton, who described in his book, he said it was a quite good script. And there were some scenes that were expanded upon. So this was going to be a movie that expanded on the 33 film in a lot of ways. And there were some changes, of course. And I'll run them over real quick here from the book. Like Black Lorenzo Simple Jr., who was one of the writers for the 76 film, Bo Goldman, who wrote this script, made Kong a more sympathetic character than in the original film. He expanded Denham's show business career and changed some other things around, like the Venture got renamed Panel Queen. Kong fights a Triceratops instead of a Tyrannosaurus. There's also a Parasaurolophus in the swamp scene instead of the Brontosaur. And the characters get developed and fleshed out to a greater degree. With Andero not being as naive as in the 33 film and going to oppose Kong's exploitation of film. And Denham was actually the film's bad guy, a full-out villain, and Kong killed him at the end of the film. when Denim catches a ride on one of the fire planes so he could film the airplane attack on Kong.
Well, but it's interesting, you know. I could, you know, if you ever read the original Kong novel, his original in the original Kong novel, rather, Kong is actually chased for a time by 2 or I believe 3 Triceratops in there. And if you guys are fans of the movie, you know that. And from the novel, what's happening is that when that whole log scene takes place, the reason those men are running across the log is they're running away from something, and then they end up facing Kong on the other end. Speaking of which, Sam, scenes that scared the hell out of me. I remember, man, when Driscoll was caught under that cliff and Kong is reaching down there.
Oh yeah.
And that was scary. That was scary as hell.
Crap your pants, kind of bad.
Yeah. That's the kind of thing, you know. And when he comes around, when they have those close-ups of Kong that you were talking about, Sam, it was during that log scene, but also when he in the distance when he comes around as he's approaching the log, and when you're looking at him from the other side of the log, is some scary looking stuff, man. Just his expression and all of the rest. But getting back to what you were saying, Greg, with Danforth's story, yeah, it's got some very interesting stuff. Would have been, you know, as a stop motion guy, I know it would have been treated with a lot of love and care. A lot of TLC would have gone into that.
Yeah, there was an interesting scene that because it couldn't use stuff that was unique to the film. Danforth included a scene in there where Kong fought a 1930s steam show that kind of looked like a mechanized Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Guys,
that's like right out of the Beast of Hollow Mountain.
I hate to interrupt, guys, but Scott just sent me a message saying this audio file is going to be too big if we don't stop soon. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really needed to bring that up. But
okay.
All right, I think we've had a pretty good discussion here. I think I'm ready to call today here. How about you, Joe?
I'm good to go. If people want to find out more, you know, go to the website, kongskullisland.com, and the Kong Skull Island Facebook page to keep tabs on what's going to be coming up with the new book I've got coming out, and to check out all things Skull Island.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Joe. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed it very much.
Same here, you guys. Thanks so much for your patience. I had a blast.
It was my pleasure having you on, Joe.
All right. Thank you. Stay in touch. And Scott, I don't know if you could hear me, but it was a pleasure to meet you tonight.
Yes, thank you.
There he is. Okay. All right, you guys. Thanks so much. Take care.
Take care.
And you're always welcome to come back on if you wish, once your second book gets published.
You bet. We'll be in touch, and we'll take it. We'll do all of that. It'll be a lot of fun. Then I can. Okay. I guess that was it. All right. Take care.